Here's a story for everyone. In 1959, two individuals at Russia's Vostok station in Antarctica were playing a heated game of chess. Towards the end of the game, the conversation got tense, with one player stabbing the other with an ice axe out of pure anger. Sources vary, with some saying the other individual was murdered, while others say he managed to survive the attack. After that, Russia apparently banned all chess on Antarctica indefinitely. This story has been circulating around online for a few years now, with journalists picking it up every so often. It is unclear, however, where the event is actually sourced from, and it is further unknown if the alleged ban still applies today, though some claim it does. Is this one of those stories that happened but is lost in history, stripped of all but a few details? Assuming all of this is even remotely historically accurate, why did Russia ban chess altogether on Antarctica? Here's what we know. The apparent attack in Antarctica over a game of chess was such an isolated incident. In fact, it's only ever happened once. For chess, that is. Antarctica itself is no stranger to violence though, especially considering the population on the continent at any given time. The icy wasteland houses anywhere from 1,000 to 4,500 people on it, depending on the season. Where would violence on Antarctica stem from? The answer has to do with isolation. Records show that since the late 1800s, when explorers were really trying to study Antarctica, isolation has been a big problem on the brain. And no, this isn't exclusive to Antarctica or Russia for that matter, but we'll get to that. To put it simply, this type of remote isolation makes you go insane. To understand this, it's important to first understand what isolation is and does to the brain. The most common type of isolation testing in a research setting is social isolation, which, as the name suggests, is being alone socially. Many researchers in the past have conducted experiments where they leave test subjects alone for hours in a room with no social or mental stimuli. The goal is to examine how individuals react to this type of setting. In just a few hours of nothingness, subjects begin to crave stimulation, and they show this by talking, singing, and humming to themselves. Hours after that, it's recorded that anxiety, extreme emotions, and paranoia sets in. At the end, most individuals say they begin to experience hallucinations and have a decrease in executive functioning or cognitive control. This same response to isolation is shown in prisoners locked up for an extended amount of time in confinement. Some scientists believe social isolation is then linked to depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Many researchers state our brains do this for a number of reasons. First and foremost, we are social animals, biologically built to function and work with others. When it's not possible for us to socialize, we find ways inside of our heads. In a world where we can virtually live by ourselves for most of our lives, the brain is still hardwired to think we need to be surrounded by others to thrive. One article I've read suggests this is because social isolation actually affects the activation of dopaminergic and serotonergic neurons, or the neurons responsible for making dopamine and serotonin. It's then suggested that the feeling of being lonely during isolation is just a response from your body telling you that something is wrong. That may explain why we seek out interaction during isolation periods and try to cope with the feeling caused by isolation. We lack certain chemicals in the brain. It makes sense considering some studies have shown socializing and coping to increase dopamine and serotonin levels in the body. It's worth noting that it's thought the brain hallucinates for different reasons though, a topic we can cover in a future video. All is not bad for isolation, however, as some individuals say they actually feel better after spending time in moderate to severe isolation. It's also worth noting that isolation can adversely affect the physical health of the being. A few examples include being more susceptible to illness, higher blood pressure, and even an increased risk of developing diseases. One study I've come across even shows that the brains of polar explorers slightly shrink during a winter season, with isolation being a possible contributor. So, extreme isolation has a pretty big toll on mental health and cognitive capacities of individuals. The anxiety caused from loneliness makes people less likely to be able to deal with stressful situations. The paranoia, hallucinations, and depression all limit our cognitive capacity and ability to process information. This, in turn, will cause aggressive behaviors, irritability, and even problems with learning. Is this really what researchers and technicians on Antarctica experience? After all, they aren't totally socially isolated. They do to an extent. You might think of Antarctica being some desolate place with cabins, wood-burning stoves, and boring scientific equipment, but some stations are actually pretty elaborate. Some include gyms, decent internet, gaming, dining. Between work and downtime, researchers definitely have things to do. The problem is, as referenced by Dr. Lawrence Palinkas, is the individual's psychosocial adaptation to an isolated environment. Some factors of this adaptation include the season during isolation, the amount of social interaction of the individual, and the approach of the individual in that situation. A person's background, existing mental state, and education may determine how isolated the person may feel. I found it interesting that studies suggest members of low social isolation groups report feeling angrier than their counterparts in the higher social isolation groups. Polar explorers I've read state this is similar in the Arctic. An awesome article written by Mikołaj Golachowski, a polar explorer and doctor of natural sciences, states his 3 levels of isolation coping, isolation he calls polar isolation. Namely, he says you spend a lot of time with yourself in Antarctica, and you must learn to cope with that somehow. Following routine, practicing discipline, daily activities, etc. The next is understanding your team and the people around you. It's important to try to suppress conflict and practice patience with those, especially since you might not know a lot of them. Lastly, Golachowski states that part of coping is coming together with all of the stations. Ironically, they participate in annual sports and group activities, with all bases and countries on Antarctica competing. Yes, that includes Russia. I think this is great universal advice because it translates well in our recent and ongoing pandemic lockdowns, in which many people are suffering from the effects of isolation, albeit not as intense. As I mentioned earlier, you probably guessed this isn't exclusive to Antarctica. Believe it or not, it's said a similar chess scenario played out, but in space. The story goes that in the 1980s, presumably while in orbit, a fistfight broke out between 2 Russian cosmonauts after one lost a chess game to the other. The Soviet Union subsequently banned all cosmonauts from playing chess in orbit. So yes, Russians are apparently banned from playing chess on both Antarctica and in space. Tough break. Lastly, I wanted to mention another story that came out of another Russian Antarctica station back in 2008. In October of that year, 2 individuals that worked closely on Russia's Bellinghausen station were in a conflict. It's reported that both individuals loved reading crime stories during their downtime at work. One thought it was funny to reveal the end of the stories the 2 were reading to the other individual, but one day it wasn't so funny for the spoiler. The person still reading the story got so angry with the other one, they ended up stabbing the spoiler in the chest multiple times with a knife. Spoiler alert, the person did survive. Again, this happened in October, which is the end of winter for Antarctica. I mention this because this time is reported to be the height of mental tension for researchers and technicians in the polar region. With all of this together, let's look back at the chess story of 1959. It's unclear what season this took place, though I imagine it was closer to the end of the winter months. No doubt the individual was experiencing symptoms of polar isolation. Agitation, lack of cognitive control, and anxiety, all caused from the mind's lack of social and perceptual stimulation. Was the person just unable to cope with the mental and physical strain of the Arctic? Did the person have pre-existing mental or anger issues exaggerated by isolation? Regardless, after the incident, Russia banned chess on Antarctica. On one hand, this sort of makes sense considering the nature of chess, a competitive game requiring executive functioning, planning, and thinking. With these cognitive operations hindered by the effects of isolation, that is, an increase of irritability, anger, and mental tension, it seems plausible this game could easily lead to interpersonal conflicts, maybe even murder. On the other hand, I think with the right precautions and better coping strategies already being employed on some Arctic stations and other remote places alike, Arctic chess should finally be able to be enjoyed by everyone again. What do you think? What are your thoughts on Russia's chess ban? I'd love to talk about it in the comments. Thank you for watching this video, and if you want to see more content like this, why not subscribe to the channel? If you have any other suggestions for content, leave me a comment or email me at mt.caveat@gmail.com. Have a great day, guys, and keep your mind busy during isolation.